Hello, welcome to my video. Here I'm going to cover the game between Mikhail Tal and Vasily Smyslov from Candidates in 1959. Tal played e4 and Smyslov played the Caro-Kann. And in the following matches in the 1960 and 1961, Tal had great battles against Mikhail Botvinnik. In this particular game he played d3. This setup looks very modest, but it's actually not so bad for white. It's surprisingly good for white. And now black plays very principally and he plays d5. And now knight d2 by white. These days knight f3 is very often played, and despite looking so naive, because at the first glance you might think this is just exchanging queens, but after all this, white still has some slight edge, because even though the king is on d1 ruined castle, it can very quickly go to c2 via c3, king c2, and black would have tough time organizing his pieces. It's beginning to be played more often on top level. But in the older times, knight d2 was more often played. And now e5 by black. He is trying to compete for the center as much as possible. Now Tal continues with knight gf3 and now knight d7. This move is rarely played these days, considered to be a weaker one comparing to, let's say, bishop d6. This is the most popular move and objectively the best move, because now if white tries something like Tal did in the game with d4, after ed4 taking on d5, now black doesn't have to capture back on d5, he can just go knight f6 and have some kind of Tarrasch French, which is slightly more acceptable to black. Because this d4 pawn is advanced, and just by doing that, black got more space. In some cases, black even sacrifices the pawn on d4 to get some initiative, but I might do some video on that. I won't do it in too much detail now. After this, Smyslov played knight d7. It's a bit clumsy because it closes the bishop, and now Tal chose to play d4. With losing one tempo, he didn't lose too much. The knight on d7 is a bit clumsy there, and this can be justified by that, this loss of tempo with d3 and d4. And now if black tries the same with this, now white takes on d5, and after this there's knight d4, and I think we would have a better version of the Tarrasch French for white. In the Tarrasch French, let me show you really quickly what happens after this d5, knight d2, when black plays c5 and white takes on d5, ed5. Usually this knight belongs to c6 to try to fight for d4 square, but in this case it doesn't fight, it's on d7 and it hinders the bishop's development. So I think it's a slightly more pleasant French Tarrasch for white. So that's why Smyslov took on e4, and now Tal took back with the knight, of course, and now because of this pressure on the pawn on e5, he chose to capture queen d4, and now he finishes developing by knight f6. This kind of symmetry reminds me of the Petrov. Let me show you that. Reminds me of this variation in particular. After this, d4 takes e5, here, where also black has some slight issues with developing. And I think here knight c3 is the best, and after this queen f4, and the game continues, but white is slightly more pleasant. The same goes with this line. It's also white who is slightly pushing, and now he went for bishop g5, and now bishop e7. He tries to finish developing. Also here h6 doesn't do much for black either, because after capturing on f6, taking, you can exchange queens as white and just have a pretty good position. After this, king e8, you can take on f6, take, and after bishop c4, black's king is in some trouble because it's on e8 and it can come under attack by these rooks on d and d file. Plus, damage structure on the king side doesn't help, so I would say that white has a pretty comfortable game. That's why black plays bishop e7 here. And now Tal castles with the clear intention to do some damage on the king side in case black castles, but I think he cannot afford to prolong this anymore, because knight d6 is coming next if he doesn't do it, and rook e1 next. So this was really nice of Tal just to force black to castle on the next move. Also here interesting move is just to go knight d6 immediately, not being afraid of queen exchange, because after this black has an option of queen e7 to somehow allow himself to castle, but that doesn't solve problems like we saw in the previous line with these double pawns on the f-file. After capturing, castling, black's king is quite uncomfortable, white has a bishop pair, and black's plan is very simple. He'll go bishop c4, put the rook on the e-file, and black's king is just too unsafe. So Smyslov chose to just, after long castling, to castle. Because if he does something else, like let's say knight e4, that just makes black's pieces paralyzed. Now black cannot castle kingside because the bishop is loose. He needs to make some concessions in order to make things work, in order to develop his pieces. Either to go h6 and to go g5, but that's also not a clear solution because you just go back, and where does black castle even? With h6 and g5 being played, it's not so easy to do castling so freely. Also, if you go here and play king f8, still you can just prolong with h4. Black's position is just so dangerous now. Queen is tied to defending the bishop. If bishop takes on g5, you can consider capturing like this and putting some pressure on the h7 pawn. If you go h6, now white even has bishop c4 as a move, just ignoring this threat. And the point is, after hg, just capture. And now there are threats like queen f4, just putting some pressure on f7. This whole position looks quite dangerous. If you take on h1, that's much easier, because after this, let's say bishop g5 takes. White has f4, attacks the queen, and also wants to go rook h8. So the only move to play here is to go queen h6, but you can take it and go here, and f7 hangs as well. So that means that the king has to step away, and you have the f-pawn as a passed pawn. So actually it's a bad position. If you go rook g8 here, then I guess there is queen f4 hitting on f7, and in case of this, to play g6 followed by gf7. So yeah, this whole idea with capturing on e4 is not the best. And yeah, that's why Smyslov just castled after a long castle. And now Tal played knight d6, trying to take this bishop and also to make black's pieces passive by hitting on b7 and bishop on c8. Black has several options, several very good options, and let me show you some interesting variations here. Black can go knight d5, black can play calmly here. And in case of bishop e7, to just capture back, after knight c8 to take on c8, and after, let's say, bishop d3 to go knight f6. And it seems like black is doing fine. White is still slightly better because of the bishop on d3, and overall his pieces look more stable, but black always has some ideas like queen b4 to exchange queens, or queen c7, queen f4, something like this, to somehow pull the emergency brake in case some attack is going to happen. That's the more solid line. There is one line which is riskier for black, and that's to play h6. And the reason why it's risky is that white can capture on h6 actually. It seems quite scary for black. If he captures immediately on h6, then there's knight f5 followed by g4, g5, opening up black's king, and this is quite dangerous for black. So after bishop h6, the best is to just take on d6, and after taking, to now take on h6. Now white is the one who has to think of something to somehow continue initiative. He can give a check, king h8, and now go queen f4. And now I think that black has to repeat here with king g7, and then just go back, and you cannot go to h7 because it gives you tempo with bishop d3. Also here, if you go knight g8 to defend the h6 pawn, white can continue with rook d6, hitting on h6, and if let's say f6, then white has this knight h4, followed by knight g6. So if black tries to defend against this by queen e8, then there is queen g3. He wants to go knight g6. After rook f7, bishop d3, this looks quite scary for black, but actually after rook g7, knight g6, black doesn't have to capture on g6. He can just go king h7, attacking the knight, and actually it's not easy to find anything better than perpetual check, because at the moment knight on g6 is under attack. And also if you move the knight, let's say, to f4, then the queen on g3 is under attack. If you just move the queen, let's say, to f3 or wherever, h4, let's say, that gives black some precious time to recover with knight e5 or any other move, and it might turn out that black is fine now and that there's no attack for white. So I think even in this very risky case, the best white can do is to make a draw. So that's why h6 seems very interesting. And of course, white doesn't have to capture on h6. He can go bishop h4 and continue the game normally without too many complications. But bishop h6 is something I wanted to show you, and it actually leads to almost a forced draw. If black goes knight b6, then you can take on c8 as white, and now I think if you go rook c8, queen h4 can be a bit unpleasant. That's why I think queen c8 is better, to just avoid this unpleasant pin. And now if you go rook e1, bishop d8. I don't like this line as much as h6 or knight d5, because it seems a bit artificial, since the bishop is on d8. It doesn't belong there, and it can be quite tricky for black, because bishop on d8 doesn't really do anything besides disconnecting the rooks, these heavy pieces, and I think white has easier game here with knight e5 and bishop d3 next, and eventually putting some pressure on the king side by pushing g4 and h4. So actually, besides what was played in the game, queen a5 was played, besides that, and these two moves, h6 and knight d5, those are acceptable variations for me. Maybe h6 is slightly scarier, because after h6 and bishop h4, you might invite some g4, g5, opening up the king side like that. It's always risky to push the pawn when you're attacked on that side where the pawn is. So Smyslov played queen a5, which is quite normal, trying to get some counterplay against the a2 pawn. And now bishop c4, developing plus defending the a2 pawn. If he went with also natural king b1, just getting the king into safe zone and defending the pawn, then black would have bishop d6, queen d6 and knight e4. He attacks on f2 and attacks the bishop. There is some crazy line with queen f4, but after this, white loses the exchange. After rook e1, knight h1, bishop c4. Eventually the knight gets lost, but also there are some threats like bishop e7 to release the defense from f7. Let's say if h6, then bishop e7, and you're losing the rook. It's a very complex line, so I won't bother you too much. I think after knight e4, after king b1, bishop d6, queen d6, knight e4, I think bishop d2 is the safer choice. But after this and knight d6, I think black is the one who has a slight edge, because he's a pawn up, although white has a bishop pair, but after bishop c5, black has c5. What does white do? He can take on d6, but after you capture on b4, bishop c4, there is some compensation maybe, because black's pieces still need some work to do, to develop and to get to the right places, but in the end, black is still a pawn up. Bishop c4 was the right choice to make. And now Smyslov plays b5. He's going for it. He's going for the counterplay, and he's not afraid of any complications that might appear. Also here, knight b6 was quite interesting. White has an interesting option here, to give up two pieces for a rook. After this, rook h e1. And now, even though white lacks some light pieces, his attack is very potent. His threat is actually to go rook e7 next and queen d8. And if he goes bishop e6, then white can even capture on e6. And if he takes, then bishop d2. Now knight g5 is a big threat. What to do? Queen can go to d5 to somehow make a bridge on the d file. But now white gives a check, and after king f7, to go bishop b4. The bishop on e7 hangs. So the best black can do is to give up the queen for a couple of pieces. And actually this position is not so clear. After queen b3, the b7 pawn becomes weak, but also if black organizes his pieces well, he might be able to overcome this minus of one pawn and a slightly exposed king. So yeah, this was not played in the game. Bishop c4, Smyslov played b5. And again, white had an option of going for the similar stuff with bishop f7, and after this, capture king f7, and then to go rook h e1. And now if black takes, there's this idea of rook e7, king e7, and now bishop f6, and now the point is not to capture with the knight, because in that case black is just dead lost after queen d6. If king f7, then knight e5, and this is checkmate. Also, if king e8, then you have queen c6 and black loses the rook. So here black has to capture with the pawn, but then queen e4 can happen, and after king d8 trying to somehow shelter himself, white takes bunch of pawns, but he doesn't have the final blow, and black somehow survives. Maybe the best thing that white has in this position is just perpetual check, because if you imagine black recovering from this, black will stabilize and slowly activate his pieces, maybe launch some counterattack on white's king. So I think that here the position is quite balanced, but also in the worst case white can get to some endgame, some queenless endgame, and rely on his extra pawns versus pieces. Tal didn't choose this, he went for bishop d2. He went for full complications. Smyslov went for queen a6. Also, queen a4 is quite nice, practically exchanging queens. Let's say after knight c8, you can take like this, and after bishop b3, capturing on d4 is not as good, because after this, bishop c5, knight f5 is possible, and white's knight on f5 is quite dangerous. And bishop f4 comes next. Some piece is gonna land on d6. Plus, of course, the bishop pair advantage is always very useful, and there's an option of getting some attack on the king side, even with the queens off the board. And after queen a6, instead of exchanging queens, after queen h4, the position remains quite imbalanced. Black has some chances on the queen side by c5, c4, and white has chances with g4, g5. Smyslov played a better move, queen a6. I think that move just keeps the queen on the good square, and now there's no time for bishop b3, because after c5, black is just winning a piece on d6. So now Tal wants to not waste time and not to get the bishop back to b3, because it eventually loses the piece. Also, now c5 is a big threat anyways, because if you go to d3, there is always c5 and grabbing this knight on d6. So what to do? What to do as white? Well, here Tal played knight f5. You might think at first, okay, this is nice, knight goes back to f5, and if you take on c4, I take on e7, and blah blah blah, we are fine. But actually he had to think about moves like bishop c5, this in-between move which attacks the queen and keeps attacking the bishop on b5. Smyslov didn't play this, he played bishop d8, trying to over-defend the knight on f6, because let me show you what happens if he goes bishop c5 and leave the knight somewhat unstable. If he goes to c5 here, then white goes queen h4, and in case of this, bishop c3. Now we have some powerful attack on this side. The knight cannot move, some sacrifice on g7 might come next, and it's not easy for black to play. Let me just show you on a couple of examples. For example, let's say if black just takes on a2, just I'm greedy and I'm gonna capture on a2. Now this knight on f6 is still somewhat stable, and white has two good options here. One of them is knight g7, trying to completely make the black's king naked. In case of king g7, to just capture on d7 and take the knight on the next move, which is crushing. And it leads to some terrific attack. The second option is to, in this position, take on d7 immediately, remove the defender of the knight on f6. And now in case of bishop d7, there is this nice tactic, knight h6, and what do you do if king h8? There is a nice finishing blow with queen f6. So after queen a2, rook d7 or knight g7 are quite dangerous. Also after rook d7, what can black do? if he tries to somehow deflect the bishop by bishop b4, with the idea of if white plays, let's say, knight h6 and tries the same queen sacrifice, then this doesn't quite work, because after this, and now you can take on f6 because the king is pinned. And there's no option of this. But white can do simply this, capture the bishop, and still the attack is not so much slowed down. If bishop d7, knight h6 again, king h8, and now bishop c3 back. Now again, queen f6 is a really tough threat to handle, and now if you give a check, king d2, queen takes, and now queen f6. Going for the checkmate. Now black can only defend by queen g2, because if rook g8, then there is this smaller checkmate. He must take on g2, and now knight g5 is very good. The only thing left is a couple of checks for black. After this, king e3, one more check, and after a couple of more checks, I think that white will survive this and eventually win the game. Let's say here, the only way to somehow prolong this is to deflect the knight from h6, but you can do it just by this, and after king f2, queen h4, king f1, bishop h3, and eventually after this, black has no more checks. The best he can do is to go here, but after this knight h3, white has 3 pieces for a rook, which is too much, way too much. So yeah, this was good for Smyslov that he didn't play bishop c5, which keeps the knight on f6 quite vulnerable. Even though black takes a piece, it's not quite safe. So that's why he went for bishop d8, trying to make the knight on f6 more stable. And now Tal doesn't back off, he goes queen h5, because like I said, if he goes bishop b3, there is still this idea of c5 and trapping the bishop by c4. And he doesn't really want to waste any time by bishop b3 and losing some tempi, which are quite necessary in this position. And here he goes queen h4 immediately, giving up the bishop on c4. Smyslov takes, and now queen g5, targeting on g7, which was also the plan behind queen h4. And now Smyslov played knight h5. Also here g6 was really good, but it didn't look, maybe it didn't look too appealing to black. After, let's say, knight h6, king g7, bishop c3, this looks quite scary because the other knight might come to f5, but you will see that it's not really that dangerous. After queen a2, knight h4, knight e5 now. Black is giving up some material back, but he also tries to open up the d-file in order to make some counterplay against the king, which might get into some danger. If one of the rooks gets to the d-file, then the king is also in danger on c1 because of potential checkmate on a1. And that's why black would have to sacrifice some material back, and after bishop e5 to go rook e8 to somehow force white to make some captures. And also it's useful because if you go back to c3, there is always rook e2, which is quite unpleasant, followed by some checkmates. White has to capture on f6, but after this and this, knight f5, black takes, knight f5, king g8. Now if white takes on f6, there is this check, king d2, and perpetual might appear, because what else to do? If you go for c3, there is this check, quite unpleasant. If you go here, black has two options, either to go for queen a4 and some perpetual. No, this is lost, this is lost. After this, king c1, here rook e2 is lost. I think the only move here to survive is knight d6. But now black can take and play rook d8, after which white has to give up the queen for two rooks, and I think he has some chances here, but nothing too special. So I guess that in this case, in this particular case, white has to go back to c1 and allow perpetual with queen a1. But g6 seemed a bit pushing it too much, and that's why Smyslov played knight h5, trying to give back some material, but later on he might capture on a2. Tal didn't take on h5, he played this move, and only after king h8 he took on h5. Because now threat like knight f7 is quite powerful, and what can black do here? Gh here is awful because after bishop c3, what can black do? If he goes f6, there's just capture and knight g5 next. Knight g5 targeting h7, and I don't believe that black can survive this. And also if bishop f6, then just this works out, followed by knight g5 next. For example, if you take on c3, there's knight g5. You cannot stop this checkmate, because if you go knight f6, then the rook on f8 hangs. And we have this checkmate. And that's why Smyslov just chose to capture on a2. Try to create some counterplay himself. Tal plays bishop c3, trying to save from the checkmate on a1. This was the critical moment in the game, and here Smyslov makes a huge mistake by knight f6. The only saving move here was bishop f6. And if white takes on f7, then just king g8. And if he goes to g5, there's h6. After queen g6, takes, and now you can take on g5, take, and go knight f6. So white can capture on f6, takes, rook d8. This still seems quite scary for black, but probably he's just fine after this sequence of moves. I think that black can survive this. After check, he can take on h1, and I think that white doesn't have anything better than perpetual. Just if he gives this check, king g6, rook d6, I don't believe it's too good, because after king f5, how do you proceed? If you give a check on f7, there is king e5, and by some miracle black survives, because if you do this, bishop e6 is very strong. So actually black's king on e5 is quite safe now. I don't see a way how to continue here. Maybe if f4 you can take, and if rook d4, king e5, go back, and if this, king f5. This is a miracle how black escapes these checks. And if rook f4, then just go back to g6 and escape to h7, and in the end black is a rook up. Yeah, the best he can do is to allow some perpetual. So let's go back a bit. I was here, and black played this, queen h1. There is some perpetual, but I think it's just queen e8, and if king f5, then to give this check, because after this is the point, to have this one, and after this to play queen h7, just not to allow the bishop to somehow make a bridge. I think this is the essential part, not to allow the bishop to somehow make a bridge and to attack the rook at the same time. And if king e5, I think also queen c7, yeah. I think this works, and after this, queen h7. With bishop f6, Smyslov could have saved the game, but he chose knight f6. And now you can pause the video to find the final blow. His move was queen takes f7. The simplest line here is if black captures, there is back rank issue with rook d8, and now a checkmate. So black has to do something about it. He has to somehow hinder this rook, and he did it by playing this check, king d2, and now he took on f7, but in the end white ends up having some material advantage. After this check, white is an exchange up, king f7 was played, knight e5, and white took on c6. Knight e4 by black, he tried somehow to get some counterplay, but after king e3, now the bishop on d8 and knight on e4 are under attack, so black had to do this. But after bishop d4, Smyslov simply resigned because he was down on exchange and his counterplay was already dead. He was an exchange down and also a pawn down, so he didn't see too much purpose in playing this position. That's it. If you have any questions about the game, this video, just let me know in the comment section and I'll get back to you. And yeah, that's it. Stay tuned and see you very soon. Bye.